dreamt for so long. My flesh was dull gold, and my blood rotted. Corpse after corpse left in my wake. As I awaited his return. Heed my words. I am Malenia, Blade of Miquella, and I have never known defeat.
Hey guys, Thing Fishy here, and here we are. The one you've all been waiting for. The hardest boss in From Software, and maybe even gaming history. Malenia. Now, when I started making this guide, I expected it would turn out similar to my other boss parry guides. That I'd give you guys the parry timings, show you how to avoid a couple of the other attacks, and send you on your way. But I realised quite quickly that to make this guide what I wanted it to be, which is a comprehensive walkthrough of how anyone, not just god gamers with their lizard reflexes, but anyone can beat Malenia solo using parrying, it'd have to be much, much more than that. Along the 30-hour journey making this video has taken me on, I fast realised that being able to parry Malenia perfectly is only, I would say, about 20% of the fight. So in this video, I'm going to of course show you the parry timings, but I'm also going to go into everything else that I learned about this fight along the way too, including a host of different approaches to dodging that attack. This will almost certainly be my longest parry guide and the longest video on this channel. But if there's ever a video to risk going into too much detail on, I think it's probably this one. So hopefully this video will save you some of the hours that it took me to decide on the best strategies for this fight. So first off, let's talk levels. Now, I did this fight on a level 90 character, which is lower than I'd recommend for this fight on a casual playthrough. To my mind, Malenia almost feels like a DLC boss, so I think I'd almost recommend beating the main game before you face her. But as I know a few of you are relying on this guide for your future RL1 playthroughs, I didn't want to flatten her with a level 150 character with a damage output that's nowhere near accomplishable at RL1. While my bleed build here is very strong, I've watched other players beat Malenia in the same way I do here at RL1 with just a couple of extra ripostes needed in the event of a perfect fight. Every other strategy I use in this fight is available to RL1 players too, and I will be speaking about certain things that RL1 players must avoid. So let's get to the fight. The first thing we need to do is to get consistent at parrying Malenia's standard attacks. So I'm going to approach these in the order of difficulty, starting with the easiest. By far Malenia's easiest attack is the jumping attack. You want to train yourself to use the gaps this attack creates to heal, buff or attack. The best way I found to avoid this attack is to strafe around her to the right. When she lands, she has a long recovery period during which you can get exactly 3 R1s in safely, while still being able to parry her next attack. Any more than 3 and you'll find yourself at the mercy of RNG. Later in this video you will see me doing as many as 6 attacks here, but this is only because I know I have enough health to tank through whatever she does next if I miss the parry or get bad RNG. Her grab attack is utterly devastating and is a one-shot even at endgame levels, but can easily be dodged by rolling at just about any point after she starts the animation. Her stab attack is also very powerful, but relatively easy to dodge. Roll to the side when you start to see her descend towards the ground. Next up, we have the 2 most consistent parryable attacks. The two attacks where she dodges either to the left or to the right before it. You can parry the right swing by inputting here when you see her head dip, and the left swing by inputting here when her hand reaches the top of its swing. Another attack that is very easily parryable is this combo she does that starts with her hand sparking. This is a really dangerous attack and will stun lock lower health players to death very quickly. But it's also actually one of the really consistent ones to parry. Parry here when she lunges towards you. Now for the lunging spin, this can be parried by inputting here just as she leaves the ground. And lastly, here's an attack you'll see far more rarely at close range, her charging slash. Dodge this by rolling twice to the side as you see her coming towards you. Now we start getting to the attacks that are going to cause you trouble. The first is this combo that she starts with a very familiar looking kick attack. Now I can't stress this enough, don't parry the kick, roll the kick. Then she will usually follow it up with the next attack, the fast 1-2 combo. Taking both these hits will be game over at RL1, and if that's what you're doing, expect this to be the attack that you die from the most. It's a really awkward parry input, but can be done consistently by pulling the trigger here when you see her start to raise her hand. And finally, the attack that gave me the most trouble and took me hours to get down. You might think that this very well telegraphed attack that she does directly in front of you might be one of the easier ones to parry, but you'd be wrong. There is some sort of hitbox issue on this attack that means if you're walking into her as she does it, which is exactly what you should do with every other boss in the game and indeed series, you're going to miss the parry and get hit every single time. The solution for this attack is actually to be holding backwards on your controller as you parry. The input is here when you see her sword reach your 12 o'clock. This will take a while to get into your hands and can cause trouble if you're already at a distance, but it's the last piece of the parrying puzzle. So once you get the hang of parrying these attacks consistently, you're going to start getting her down to 65% health. Why 65? Well, that's when she starts doing it. The most devastating and hard to dodge attack in From Software history. The Waterfowl dance. This attack heals Malenia massively, and bearing the full brunt of it will kill any player at pretty much any level. And dodging it feels almost impossible, without first doing some research. So that's exactly what I did. After getting to the Waterfowl stage of the fight quite consistently, I knew if I was going to dodge it, I'd have to consult the work of some much better players than me. Now, first I want to talk about some methods I didn't use. The first, which is likely the easiest and one of the most talked about in the community, is to throw a freezing pot at Malenia as soon as you see her jump up to start Waterfowl. This will cancel the attack completely. Now, I hope I've done enough on this channel to prove that I'm not one of those people who says that using resources the game gives you, like sleep or frost pots and summons, is cheating. That couldn't be further away from my mentality. But if I was going to solo Malenia, I wanted to do it without feeling like I'd nerfed her by removing her most dangerous attack. I didn't want to beat her in Waterfowl's absence. I wanted to do it in spite of Waterfowl. The next option I decided against is perhaps the ultimate method for dodging Waterfowl. You can see this here in some footage from Ongbal, and I'll link his tutorial for this in the description, along with all of the strategies from some other players that we're going to look at later. This technique will consistently dodge Waterfowl at close range and involves circling her by running 360 degrees around her while she's in the air. This will redirect the most dangerous part of the attack to happen behind you, and you can roll the second half of the attack quite easily. This approach is incredibly difficult to master, And since I'm on PS5 and therefore without access to any practice tools, I knew it would probably take weeks if not months for me to get it, if I was capable of it at all, when I was only getting one attempt in every few minutes. And finally, there are lots of options to dodge this attack when you are not at close range. Having space between you and her when the attack starts gives you lots of room for error and makes this attack far less intimidating. For me, this wasn't an option first because of my parrying strategy, meaning I was constantly at close range, and second because even if I did have time to get out of range, by the time my slow brain realised the attack was happening, it was usually too late to run away. So I needed a strategy which was consistent, achievable for my panicked and slow to react brain, possible at point blank range, and usable at RL1 for you lunatics doing it. So first off, I actually want to talk about the second part of Waterfowl first. The attack has two main sections, the first two flurries, then a short wind up, then the next three flurries. Now, the first time there was any light at the end of the tunnel for me with this fight was when I worked out, after a lot of trial and error, that the final three flurries are quite easy to dodge. If you're in normal melee range to Malenia, when she does this midpoint wind up, you can dodge flurries 3, 4 and 5 by rolling to her right, exactly when you'd roll if this were a standard swing, rolling in the same direction again just after, then immediately rolling backwards. To clarify, that's rolling 1 o'clock, then 1 o'clock, then 6 o'clock. And trust me when I say that this is completely consistent. Now, while figuring out this gave me hope, I still needed to deal with the first two flurries, and I found two methods that look good. These came from watching Lobos and Distortion 2's first RL1 wins against Malenia. I've been watching Lobos and Dist for years, and in the unlikely event that you're watching this and aren't already aware of these guys, check them out on their YouTube and Twitch channels if you want to see true mastery of these games. So Lobos' approach was to use the Turtle Shield and its Ash of War Barricade Shield to deal with the first two flurries, then use 3 rolls to evade the other 3. Now, the best thing about this approach is how easy it is to execute. After finding this method, I actually did it on my very first try. So when you see Malenia jump up, you switch your left hand weapon from the buckler to the turtle shield, which you have equipped in your secondary slot, then press L2 for your barricade shield. This will block the first 2 flurries, then dodge the next 3 by rolling up and right twice, then backwards once. The only downside of this method is that Malenia will still regain health from hitting you. If you're using a status build like Bleed or Frost, which you should be, this will make her a little bit more tanky later in the fight, where she has healed back a few of your procs, as well as increasing her resistance. But if you ask me, that's a well worth trade for not having to worry about Waterfowl ever again. This is definitely the easiest method to deal with Waterfowl, and certainly the one I'd recommend to most players. But as I've said before on this channel, I'm a Bloodborne player at heart, and stupidly admitting that I needed a shield for this fight was just one step too far for my tiny brain. So despite the simplicity and relative ease of this strategy, I decided against it. So what was Distortion's solution to Waterfowl? The answer was using the Bloodhound Step Ash of War to outspace the first 2 flurries, then using it again to dodge the next 3. If you're not familiar with Bloodhound Step, it's an Ash of War that gives you a dash movement that has more iframes than a standard roll. It's super overpowered for dodging bosses and enemies, but it also has a secondary less intended use as being the fastest way of travelling on foot. Now, this was particularly exciting for me because it meant that I could react later to Waterfowl, but by using Bloodhound Step to open the distance instead of running, I could still outspace the attacks in the same way someone who had reacted much earlier and ran away would. So after an hour or so of playing with this, I finally had something that felt good, and I ended up with a fusion of these 2 different approaches. When Malenia jumps up, I'd swap my buckler in my left hand to an empty weapon slot. This will default the weapon art to the Ash of War of the weapon in my right hand, which was Bloodhound Step. Press L2 twice in quick succession to outspace the first 2 flurries. Pause and run towards her for her wind up, then roll 3 times to avoid the next 3. That direction order again being 1 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 6 o'clock. Now depending on your reaction time, this should be pretty consistent. If you're slightly late, you might get hit by the last attack of the second flurry. If you mess up your dodges, you might get hit in the last few. But after an hour or so of practicing this, I got to the point where I was dodging everything 95% of the time and only taking survivable damage when I was a little late. At this point, with her standard attacks and Waterfowl worked out, you have everything you need for Phase 1. Now let's talk about Phase 2. The biggest difference between Phase 1 and Phase 2 is that Phase 2 Malenia is much more aggressive and makes it far harder for you to buff or heal compared to her relative passivity at range in Phase 1. The rule for Phase 2 is only heal or buff when she is in an animation of some kind. So the very first thing you need to know is how to react to her first scripted attack that she'll do at the beginning of Phase 2. Now this is important, please remember this. You're already locked onto her when the cutscene ends. You don't need to lock on. If you hit lock on, you'll lock off and mess up your camera. Walk to the side of her and roll as soon as you see her start to move towards you. As soon as your roll ends, sprint away from her to avoid the AoE. Once you've done this a couple of times, you shouldn't ever have to worry about it again. The vast majority of her Phase 2 is the same as Phase 1. However, it's much harder to consciously recognise the attacks because of her wings getting in the way. This is where you have to trust your muscle memory. If you've learnt Phase 1 well enough to get here consistently, I promise you that trusting those parry reflexes you've built up will get you through this. The final things to worry about in Phase 2 are her Scarlet Rot attacks. Now thankfully, Waterfowl remains the same as Phase 1. It's a little bit more dangerous now because it inflicts Scarlet Rot, but you can dodge it in exactly the same way as Phase 1. She does, however, have this new swipe and stab combo. You want to roll the swipe just as she's heading towards you, and the stab when her hand is fully pulled back. She'll also do this AoE that starts with her jumping up, which makes it easy to confuse with Waterfowl. You can dodge this attack easily by rolling into it, and if you confuse it many times like I did with Waterfowl, you'll be well out of the way by the time she lands. And speaking of distance, we finally get to the last big hurdle of this fight, her clone attack. Like Waterfowl, this attack is devastating to take the full force of, and quite hard to dodge consistently. The solution I found to be the easiest here is simply to outspace this attack. If you've gone with the Bloodhound Step method, you can simply spam that backwards to get out of her reach. Unfortunately, if you've gone for the Turtle Shield method, you are just left with running away, but this is usually just as effective. If you're wondering if you can tank it with Barricade Shield, unfortunately not, but I did try it. Now there are more complicated and perfect ways of dodging this attack, but if you're anything like me, your reflexes are going to be overloaded with adrenaline by the time you reach this point in the fight, so it's not the ideal time to be learning new complicated dodges. The worst case scenario for running away from this attack is if you are at point blank range when she starts it. In this case, you can either tank the hit from this fourth clone, who's the only one you have to worry about, or prepare to dodge him once you've outrun the third clone. And there we are, how to parry Malenia. This fight was without doubt the hardest thing I've ever accomplished in a video game. And I think the most telling thing about how I feel about this fight is what I did straight afterwards. I loaded up my previous save file so I could fight her again. Now, I usually do this when making a video in case there's any extra footage that I need. But after beating her a further 3 times since my original win and finalising all the footage for this video, yep, she's still alive, so I can fight her again on this character. And in my books, any boss who you fought for probably a grand total of about 30 hours now yet can't wait to fight again, must truly be a masterpiece. Malenia's standing as the undoubted hardest boss in From Software history also makes her easily the hardest boss in any base game. So I'm incredibly excited, and it must be said a little terrified to see what Miyazaki has in store for us in the DLC. If Malenia is Elden Ring's nameless king, I cannot wait to fight its Gale.
Oh! Yes! Yes!